On May 12, 1945, just a few days after Germany's official surrender, a train carrying prisoners of war rumbled slowly toward an American camp. The iron wheels screeched against the rails, jolting violently, forcing those inside the cars to sway back and forth. They were not soldiers with weapons in hand, but young women, female auxiliaries, logistics staff, and communications workers of the Nazi army, now reduced to prisoners of war. None of them knew exactly what awaited them ahead. All they had were rumors, scattered bits of information, and the haunting images planted in their minds by years of propaganda. In the barracks, in the shelters, in the restless nights between air raids, they had heard the same refrain over and over. If you are captured, the Americans will torment you. They will kill you, humiliate you, turn you into slaves. For the male soldiers, propaganda painted death as swift and even honorable, to be shot, executed, or worked to exhaustion. But for women, the fear was far more terrifying. They imagined being stripped of dignity, collectively assaulted, turned into playthings for the enemy. These images, exaggerated though they may have been, had carved themselves deeply into their minds, making every moment on the train ride to the American camp a trembling, breathless journey. Inside the car, the air felt compressed and heavy. Pale young faces, streaked with dust and sweat, flickered in the dim light seeping through cracks in the doors. They were no longer the neat, disciplined auxiliaries in pressed uniforms. Their clothes were worn and filthy, many held together with strips of cloth. Boots torn, soles cracked. Hair tied hastily into loose knots, faces hollowed by days of irregular meals. Many of the girls were barely in their 20s, not long out of school, swept up by the machinery of war. They had joined not out of heroic ideals, but under social pressure, propaganda, or simply because it was the only path left to secure food and shelter in a country buried under bombs. Now they were no longer soldiers of the Reich, but weary bodies surrendered to fate. In each mind, a single question repeated endlessly: what will they do to us? Some were convinced they would be taken out and executed in groups, a death swift yet horrifying. Others imagined being forced into mines, worked to death like slaves. But most, especially the younger ones, were consumed by fear of humiliation. Whispers in the barracks that the Americans treat German women as spoils of war, that they will make you serve the soldiers in the camps, drove many to cling to one another, or even deliberately make themselves look filthy and ragged, hoping to draw less attention. For them, surrender did not mean safety. Surrender only opened another threshold, where the darkness seemed thicker, where they no longer had any control. On the train, silence reigned. No one dared speak aloud, only hurried whispers, swallowed by the grinding of wheels on steel. Someone furtively pulled from a pocket a small, blurred photograph of family, then quickly tucked it away again, afraid even a glance from the person beside them could be a threat. Suspicion and unease turned them into shadows, pressed together yet distant. Among them was a young woman of about 24, her angular face and high cheekbones made gaunter by hunger. She had once worked as an assistant in a communications unit. Her father had died on the Eastern Front, her mother in an air raid, her little brother lost in the ruins of Leipzig. She boarded the train, torn between resilience and despair. In the pocket of her coat, she kept a faded handkerchief, her mother's last remnant. Whenever thoughts of the future overwhelmed her, she clutched it tightly, as if holding on to a fragment of a vanished life. The night before, they had been given one last meal in Germany, a thin soup of turnips and a few crumbs of dry bread. Many devoured it greedily, thinking it might be their final meal. As the 24-year-old girl swallowed the brittle crust, she thought of her brother. Is he still alive? Does he have anything to eat? Guilt and helplessness stabbed at her chest. Outside, Germany had collapsed. Cities burned black, villages lay in ruins, millions starved or vanished. But for the prisoners on the train, the outside world seemed distant. They were trapped in another reality, a narrow corridor leading into darkness, where only vague yet merciless fear remained. Some tried to hold on to pride. They told themselves that if death came, they would meet it standing tall. They remembered the instructions from training. Never trust the enemy's mercy. Better to die than to be dishonored. Those words now pounded in their heads like hammer blows, making them tremble all the more. Yet beneath that thin layer of pride lay a naked truth. They were starving, exhausted, and terrified. Many had not menstruated in months from malnutrition. Their hands shook not only from fear, but from physical weakness. When they looked at each other, it was no longer comradeship they saw, but the reflection of primal fear. Each time the train slowed, their hearts lurched. Was this the destination? Would they be herded off, driven into an open field, and gunned down? Minutes stretched into hours, every grinding turn of the wheels slicing into already frayed nerves. In those moments, the future ceased to exist. There was only the suffocating present, only the agony of waiting. Hunger and thirst could be endured for days, but waiting in fear was almost unbearable. And in that waiting, they began to erode from within, long before any real punishment had come. When the train finally slowed, then stopped completely, every eye turned toward the iron door. No one spoke, but all understood. The moment of fate had arrived. Hands clenched instinctively, some whispered prayers, others swallowed dryly, forcing themselves to stand straight. The door clanged open, sunlight poured in, dazzling their eyes. They held their breath, expecting shouts, gun barrels thrust in their faces, but instead the wind rushed in from outside, carrying with it a scent no one had expected. The light from outside burst in, striking eyes that had long grown accustomed to the darkness of the train car. Many of the women squinted. Some raised their hands to shield their faces, wavering in a haze of anxiety. They braced themselves for barking orders, snarling dogs, the stomp of boots, the sounds of power and violence. But instead, all they heard was the wind rustling through the trees, and from a distance, strange noises, the clatter of metal, pots and pans knocking together, voices speaking evenly, without menace. Then suddenly it came. The smell. A strange, heavy, savory aroma seemed to flood straight into their chests. It was the smell of bacon frying on a hot pan. The crackle of fat spitting accompanied the scent, so strong it drowned out the odor of oil, rust, and the stifling sweat of the train car. For a moment, the women froze in shock. They stared at one another, eyes wide with disbelief. For years, they had survived on watery soup, crusts of dry bread or ration scraps left over from the collapsing home front. Meat, especially rich, fatty bacon, had all but vanished from their taste memories long ago. Yet now, at the very instant they had steeled themselves for torment, humiliation, perhaps even death, the first thing to greet them was the warm, luxurious scent of food. One girl covered her mouth as if to hold back sudden tears. Another stood rigid, her mind swirling in chaos. Is this a trick? Do they mean to lure us with this smell, just to laugh when we beg like beggars? Suspicion, drilled into them for years, was not easily shaken, and yet their empty stomachs betrayed them, twisting and growling so violently that all pride and caution seemed to falter. As the prisoners were led out in groups, no one was struck. No rifle pressed to their backs. The American soldiers simply stood firm, motioning for them to line up. Their faces were stern, but not cruel. There were no leering eyes, no mocking laughter, only the weary expressions of men who had also endured war. In the sunlight, the scene before them was nothing like what they had imagined. Beyond the barbed wire stood rows of simple wooden huts, an open yard, a few modest watchtowers. No whips, no dark dungeons. And most striking of all, just nearby, a field kitchen where white smoke curled skyward from large pans of sizzling fat. The Americans were frying bacon, thin reddish-brown strips curling on the hot pan, glistening with grease. The hiss of melting fat mingled with the intoxicating smell, so strong that many of the women couldn't help but swallow involuntarily. It was a humiliating sensation. They had once been told that Germans are the master race, yet here they stood, trembling behind the wire, overwhelmed by the enemy's food like beggars at a feast. A young blonde prisoner whispered half to herself, "No, this can't be. This is for us?" The girl beside her replied, voice shaking, "No, surely it's for the Americans. We'll be starved or given scraps." But within minutes, the truth revealed itself. Trays of food were brought forward, placed before them. Not just moldy bread or watery broth, but full portions. Soft white bread, a few potatoes, an apple, and, most astonishingly, several slices of hot bacon, gleaming with fat. At that moment, many of the women stared in bewilderment, unable to believe their eyes. Some burst into tears, torn between relief and shame. Trembling hands lifted the bacon, hesitating. "Am I really allowed to eat this? Is this some test?" But the smell was too much, splintering all restraint. They took a bite, and the salty, rich crispness exploded across their tongues, reawakening bodies starved for months. For several minutes, the air filled with the hurried sounds of chewing. Yet beneath it lingered a heavy silence, for their hearts held more than joy. Shame gnawed at them. How could those branded savages feed them food more lavish than anything left in their own homeland? How could the enemy show kindness when their own nation had abandoned millions to starve in ruins? One prisoner sobbed uncontrollably, not because the bacon was delicious, but because it made her think of family. Her little brother, if still alive, was probably scavenging potato peels in the trash. Her mother, if still somewhere in the rubble, was likely huddled in the cold, belly empty. And she was eating bacon from the hands of the enemy. It was their first great shock, not of violence or cruelty, but of unexpected kindness. It did not break their bodies, but it rattled their minds. Everything they had believed, that Americans were brutal, that German women would be dishonored, suddenly wavered before a truth too simple to ignore. The enemy was feeding them bacon. This shock planted a strange seed, gratitude mingled with resentment, relief entwined with humiliation. They ate to survive, but each mouthful felt like a blade cutting into old pride. In silence, they began to realize that war destroyed more than cities. It was tearing down the walls inside their own minds. From that moment, bacon ceased to be just food. It became a symbol of paradox, of fractured belief, of the shattering realization that the enemy could be kinder than what they had known at home. And in the drifting scent of bacon carried on the wind, a different kind of war began. A war within themselves, one that would last for decades. The first days in the American prison camp passed like a chain of paradoxes. After the initial shock of the smell of bacon, the German female prisoners began to grow accustomed to a reality utterly unlike what they had imagined. They were not stripped naked, not beaten, not turned into playthings as propaganda had drilled into their minds. Instead, they were placed in wooden barracks, simple but clean, each with her own bed, blanket, and pillow, luxuries they had not dared to dream of for many months. In the mornings, a whistle signaled mealtime. They lined up, trays were handed out, white bread, potatoes, boiled vegetables, sometimes even a bit of meat or sausage. Bacon was not always on the menu, but the aroma from the kitchen became an enduring memory. The way the American soldiers distributed rations, efficient, neither contemptuous nor overly kind, left the women feeling both unsettled and relieved. It was nothing like the image of bloodthirsty enemies they had been taught to hate to the bone. Yet the tension within them did not disappear. Holding their trays, many still glanced around nervously, expecting mocking laughter or scrutinizing stares. None came. The Americans treated them as part of their duty, prisoners to be fed, managed, kept in order. That calmness was, in some ways, more disorienting than cruelty. Deep inside, they did not know how to respond to this kindness, with gratitude, suspicion, or both at once. During the day, aside from meal times, they were required to perform light camp duties, sweeping, washing, carrying supplies. The work was not harsh, not enforced with whips. Sometimes, they were even allowed to write letters home, though no one knew if those letters ever reached their families. Holding a pen, scribbling shaky lines back to a ruined homeland, felt like both a fragile glimmer of hope and a stab to the heart. For outside, Germany lay in ruins, millions starving, and here they were, the captured, being fed and sheltered by the enemy. In the evenings, instead of beatings or torture, the Americans lit the barracks. They brought books, newspapers, even a few magazines and worn English novels. At first, the women merely glanced without comprehension, but curiosity soon crept in. Some began to learn words, asking one another, and to their astonishment, American soldiers organized basic English classes. A few of the guards had once been teachers before the war. Now they stood before German prisoners, teaching simple vocabulary: bread, Brot, water, Wasser, peace, Frieden. The strangeness of it was almost unbearable. They had braced themselves to die in shame. Yet here they were learning a new language, glimpsing another world. At times, documentary films were screened, most about concentration camps and what the Nazis had done in Europe. At first, the women resisted, disbelieving, dismissing it as enemy propaganda. But when images of piled corpses appeared on the screen, when the hollow-eyed faces of Jewish survivors stared back, their denial began to waver. Many left the screenings with red eyes, avoiding one another's gaze. Some tried to dismiss it. Lies, staged lies. But deep inside, the seed of doubt had taken root. From books, from language lessons, from those films, a truth slowly emerged. The enemy they had been told to hate was not exactly what they had been taught. And more importantly, their Germany, the homeland in which they had placed all their faith, had hidden, even distorted, reality itself. At night, many of the women lay awake. The clean bedding, the steady breathing of fellow prisoners, and above all the alien sense of safety, left them unsettled. Safety, a word they had not dared to imagine through years of war, had reappeared in the most unlikely place, the enemy's camp. But with that safety came unrelenting guilt. At night they dreamt of their ruined homeland, of mothers, siblings, friends starving among rubble. They awoke in sweat, sitting bolt upright in the darkness, asking themselves, "Why do I get to live like this, while my loved ones do not?" The kindness of the Americans became a double-edged sword, cutting them with guilt as much as it gave them comfort. Secret conversations began to stir in the camp. Someone whispered, "Maybe everything we once believed was a lie." Another quickly hushed them. "Be silent. Don't let the Americans hear. They want us to betray, to forget our German pride." Yet each day the rebuttals grew weaker. The daily reality, food, beds, books, lessons, quietly testified otherwise. For many of the women, the memory of bacon remained as a marker. It was not merely food, but a gateway into another world. From that point, they began to sense that perhaps there existed another America, not the monster painted by propaganda. And at the same time, they came to realize there was another Germany too, a Germany that had lost truth and abandoned its own people. Each day in the American camp was not merely survival, but an inner battle. They no longer feared physical torment, but they faced a different fear, the fear of truth. For truth meant admitting that everything they had once believed, sacrificed, and lost might have been built on a colossal lie. And within that paradox, life in the American camp became unforgettable. It was neither heaven nor hell. It was a gray zone where quiet kindness collided with gnawing guilt, where full stomachs clashed with memories of hunger back home, where English lessons intersected with the echo of a nation's ruin. For those women, those were days beyond naming. Yet years later, when they recalled them, they admitted it was in the American camp, the place they thought would be darkest, that they experienced the greatest upheaval of their lives. An upheaval not born of violence but of normalcy, a full meal, a book, a gentle lesson, and the drifting scent of bacon in the wind. Throughout their months in the American prison camp, one image recurred like a red thread in the memories of the German female prisoners: a slice of bacon, golden brown and crisp, releasing its rich, smoky aroma every morning. At first it was horror itself, a shock that made them want to vomit. But gradually, bacon became a strange symbol, at once tempting and haunting, stirring both guilt and the glimpse of a new horizon. On the very first day they encountered bacon, many refused to touch it. They whispered that perhaps the Americans were trying to humiliate them, forcing them to eat something unclean as proof of Germany's defeat. Some even tried to throw it away, keeping only the bread and potatoes. But hunger, the kind that had gnawed at them for weeks on the march, in shelters during days of flight, would not allow rejection forever. Then one morning a young girl nervously lifted a slice of bacon to her lips. The salty, fatty crispness spread across her tongue, and her eyes widened in astonishment. It was nothing like she had imagined, neither foul nor degrading. On the contrary, it was undeniably delicious. She chewed with tears brimming in her eyes, not knowing if they came from happiness or shame. Others watched and silently followed. From then on, the morning scent of bacon was both a challenge and a salvation. Bacon became a paradoxical emblem. For them, it was tied to life inside the camp, where the enemy provided food, beds, even books. Eating bacon was an act of survival, yet it felt like a quiet betrayal. In every crisp bite, they could hear their conscience whispering, "You are taking favors from the enemy," while outside, your people are starving. Some nights, the women shared strange dreams. They were seated at their old family tables, but instead of German sausages or dark bread, the only dish was American bacon. Their emaciated mothers looked at them with reproach, while younger siblings reached out for a strip they dared not share. They woke trembling, hearts heavy with betrayal, asking themselves, "Am I slowly becoming part of this world, the world of the enemy?" Bacon also embodied another contradiction: abundance set against ruin. While they ate their fill, back home people queued for meager rations, wilted turnips, thin soup, or coarse bread mixed with sawdust. News from outside was scarce, but sometimes, through brief letters or the guards' words, they learned that Germany was writhing in famine. That knowledge made every slice of bacon weigh like lead in their hands. And yet, bacon also carried an undeniable lesson: the many meanings of freedom. For the first time, they realized freedom was not only a flag or patriotic slogans. Freedom was also the ability to sit down and eat a full breakfast, without fighting, without trembling under falling bombs. Bacon, a food seemingly trivial, embodied an entire world they had never known before. A world of plenty, of ordinary routines, of simple comforts that Nazi Germany and war had stripped away. Years later, when the war was over and they returned home, the memory of bacon haunted them still. Some never touched it again, for each slice awakened guilt and the shame of defeat. Yet others, in silence, admitted that bacon had opened a door to the wider world. It was a lesson in difference, in how a culture could shape people, not through force, but through the small, everyday things. In later conversations, many former prisoners recalled, it was bacon that first made them question everything. They asked, "If the enemy is truly cruel, why do they feed us so well? If Germany is truly great, why does it let its people starve?" The answers did not come at once, but the questions planted doubt, something the Nazi regime had tried to extinguish at all costs. Bacon, then, was more than food. It was the first crack in the wall of belief. From there, through English lessons, books, and camp screenings, that wall slowly crumbled. Until one day, They realized freedom, dignity, and truth might lie not where they had thought. The bitterest truth was this: Bacon proved that the so-called enemy cared for its prisoners better than their own government cared for its people. That contrast cut to the core of their conscience, leaving them both grateful and resentful, both hopeful and despairing. Perhaps that is why, decades later, when their hair had turned white, they still spoke of bacon as the most haunting memory of their lives, not for its flavor, but for the meaning it carried. It was a symbol of irreconcilable contradiction, between life and death, enemy and compatriot, guilt and truth, past and present. And perhaps, within that slice of bacon, they tasted the harshest truth of all. War does not only kill with bombs and bullets, but also with lies. And truth, sometimes, comes from the smallest of things, like a strip of crisp, smoky bacon in the dawn light. If bacon was the first crack in the wall of belief, then what followed in the American camp widened that crack into a vast fracture. Fragments of truth, like steady hammer blows, began to shatter the shell of lies in which they had lived for years. The young female prisoners, once believers in the slogan Deutschland über alles, once proud voices in Hitler's parades, were now forced to face a brutal reality. What they had believed in might have been nothing but darkness. The greatest shock came from the film screenings. At first they assumed it was just another form of propaganda, the way the Nazis had staged films to make the people believe in victory and righteousness. But when the images flickered onto the white sheet stretched across the barrack, no one remained unmoved. Mass graves, emaciated corpses piled like logs, the hollow stares of concentration camp survivors, all captured with chilling realism. It was no longer second-hand stories or newspaper articles one could ignore. It was truth laid bare, recorded by the camera's eye. Some leapt up and shouted, "No! Lies! The Americans fabricated this to defame Germany!" Others covered their ears or turned away. But there were also girls who sat frozen, faces buried in their hands, shoulders trembling. Denial grew harder with every frame that replayed, refusing to let them escape. After each screening, the barracks sank into heavy silence. No one wanted to speak. No one dared meet another's eyes. They lay awake on their beds, staring into the dark mines, torn between two worlds. The world they had been taught to believe in, glorious Germany, a just war, and the world now revealed where Germany itself had sown death for millions of innocents. Then came newspapers and books. At first they thought the Americans brought them only to brainwash. But when articles were translated into German, when numbers, documents, and testimonies appeared, they began to realize this truth could not be fiction. It was too detailed, too painful, too vast to be invented from nothing. One prisoner, the daughter of a school teacher in Munich, whispered to her friend after many sleepless nights, "Perhaps our parents were deceived. Perhaps we were all deceived." Her words sounded like betrayal, yet also like a sigh of release. Another shock came through news from home. In rare letters that arrived, they learned their cities had become rubble, that relatives queued for meager rations, that some starved to death in the streets. Many letters never reached their recipients at all, replaced by whispers. "Berlin has fallen. Hamburg is burned. Dresden is ash." Inside the camp, they ate white bread, potatoes, sometimes even chocolate. Outside, their families shivered in the dark. That contrast became a festering wound, making every bite taste of guilt. Among the prisoners circulated stories, not from the guards but from fellow Germans, about women in Berlin assaulted by Soviet soldiers, about orphans roaming the streets, about young German boys thrown into battle with rusty rifles and blind faith. These tales only sharpened the truth. The Third Reich had not protected them, but dragged them into the abyss. Some women began keeping secret diaries. In them, they confessed what they dared not speak aloud: doubts about the regime, shame when thinking of their starving compatriots, even a shy gratitude toward the Americans who fed them, taught them, and showed them pieces of truth. Those diaries would later stand as raw testimony to the harsh psychological journey they endured. But the path was far from smooth. Some remained stubborn, clinging to old beliefs, insisting it was all deception, that Nazism was still right, that the enemy were the true liars. They despised fellow prisoners who doubted, calling them weak, traitorous. Arguments erupted in the barracks at night, sometimes nearly turning violent. This division mirrored Germany itself, a nation torn between past and present, between harsh truth and sweet illusion. Yet no matter how fiercely they resisted, the women could not return to the time before they had seen those films, read those papers, received those letters about loved ones dying of hunger. That shock did more than destroy old beliefs. It forced them to confront themselves. They asked, "All these years, what have I done? Did I stay silent while it all happened? Am I also responsible?" Such questions lingered like ghosts, unanswerable yet impossible to dispel. In the silence of camp nights, with the wind rustling through barbed wire, they came to understand. They were not only prisoners of the Americans. They were prisoners of their past, of lies, of their own naivety and silence, and perhaps that was the greatest pain of all. As the shocks of truth slowly settled, an emptiness began to form inside the German women prisoners. That emptiness was not only the collapse of their old beliefs, but also the haunting question: who are we, if everything we once believed was a lie? Within that void, a slow, conflicted, yet irreversible rebirth began to take shape. At first, this rebirth revealed itself in small gestures. A few prisoners volunteered to help in the kitchen, not just for an extra bite of food, but because they wanted to do something useful. Some took up teaching their fellow inmates, using their German literacy to help less educated girls read and write. Small groups even began translating snippets of American newspapers into German, then gathering to discuss and analyze them together. Each of these activities became a piece of a new identity, one that was no longer just prisoner, but human being. In the English classes organized by American soldiers, the atmosphere shifted noticeably. Where once the women had sat stiff and guarded, now many raised their hands, asked questions, and even laughed. They realized that learning a language was not only about understanding words, but also about breaking free from the prison of old thinking. When they discovered that freedom meant to do, when they wrote that word on the board, it felt as if a weight had fallen from their shoulders. Freedom was no longer a slogan shouted beneath the swastika. It was the ability to think, to question, to become an individual. Many began writing diaries, no longer just to pour out sadness, but to explore themselves. The pages thickened with lines, searching for new definitions. Who am I when I am no longer Hitler's soldier? Who am I when I am no longer forced to believe in slogans? In the darkness of the barracks, pencils wore down, leaving behind trembling yet determined handwriting, the trace of a silent rebirth. Some girls found strength in friendship. They sat together, whispering stories of home, sharing their longing for family, comforting each other when guilt overwhelmed them. In that empathy, they learned to listen, to accept each other's weakness, and to forgive themselves. The place once seen as a prison became a seedbed of sisterhood, transcending ideological divides. Even between them and some American soldiers, unusual connections emerged. Not passionate romances, for the circumstances allowed none, but a kind of respect, sometimes tinged with curiosity. A few young soldiers, who before the war had been students or factory workers, treated the women not as enemies, but as peers of the same age. They exchanged broken words in English and German, smiling when they understood one another. These fleeting moments became proof that the world could be different, that people could look at each other beyond the frame of war. Their rebirth was also marked by a quiet change in how they saw themselves. They no longer identified solely as German women prisoners, but began to feel like individuals with desires and choices. One girl, once accustomed only to obedience, confessed that she wanted to become a nurse, to heal rather than destroy. Another dreamed of studying abroad, of stepping into the wider world she had glimpsed only through books and newspapers in camp. These fragile dreams were proof of new vitality, a new identity. Of course, not everyone embraced this transformation easily. Some resisted, clinging to the past, seeing every kindness from the Americans as a trap. But even they, deep down, could not hold back the changes happening around them. For each day, when they saw a fellow prisoner smile in class, heard the scratch of pencil on paper, or felt the warmth of an embrace in the night, they knew something had shifted forever. In quiet moments, many remembered the women back home, mothers, sisters, friends, enduring unimaginable hardship. They whispered promises to themselves. If they ever returned, they would not live as before. They would not turn a blind eye to injustice, nor follow blindly the words of those in power. These promises, at first murmured, grew into a glowing ember, feeding their spirit through the long days of captivity. The greatest paradox was this. Inside the prison of the enemy, they discovered the first true freedom of their lives. That freedom did not come from the gates being opened, but from eyes, hearts, and minds being opened. And once they had tasted it, they no longer wished to return to the darkness of blind faith. As the war outside neared its end, as news of Germany's surrender reached them, many prisoners broke into tears, not only for the defeat, but because they knew the past had closed and another door had opened. They did not know what awaited them in their ruined homeland, but they knew they had changed. In the shadows of the American camp, a new version of themselves had been born, stronger, more human, and freer. And perhaps it was this rebirth that became the deepest memory they carried with them, outlasting fear, guilt, and even the lingering smell of bacon that haunted every morning. On the day the camp gates opened, many German women prisoners wept. Their tears were not born of simple joy, but from hearts torn between two opposing feelings, the longing to return home and the fear of facing the world outside. For months, even years, the American camp had been a closed space where they ate their fill, slept safely, studied, and slowly began to rediscover themselves. Now, in freedom, they felt unmoored, as if they were being cast into an abyss of uncertainty. Military trucks carried them away, leaving behind barbed wire, wooden barracks, and even the lingering smell of bacon each morning. The road home stretched dusty and bleak, passing ruined fields, half-burned villages, and cities reduced to smoke and rubble. For many, it was the first time they saw with their own eyes the reality they had only heard about or read in camp. As the trucks rolled into the outskirts, the scenes cut into them like knives. Collapsed houses, scorched walls, rooftops reduced to charred frames. Children wandered the streets, hollow-eyed and ragged. Old people sat by the roadside, palms outstretched for crumbs. The women fell silent, unable to summon the courage to speak. One whispered, "We lived in an oasis, never knowing our homeland had turned to ashes." Her words drew tears from many. They recalled the full meals in camp, the crispy slices of bacon, and guilt rose in them sharper than ever. Out here, their people starved. Inside the enemy's prison, they had been well fed. When the truck stopped to release them at small stations, they stepped down on trembling legs. Familiar streets were now heaps of rubble. Families were gone, scattered or lost in chaos. One girl returned to her old home in Cologne and found only a bare foundation and a crooked wooden cross. Another searched at the train station, hoping to see her parents, but found only notice boards crowded with names of the missing. Faced with this reality, the memory of the American camp became a painful paradox. In the darkness of war, where they should have found hell, they had glimpsed the first sparks of humanity and knowledge. And in their homeland, where they should have found comfort, They found only ruin, hunger, and despair. The contrast left them speechless, able only to cover their faces and weep in silence. Yet those very memories became the strength that carried them forward. The English lessons, the diary pages, the nights spent wrestling with truth, all had forged a different kind of resilience. When they saw starving orphans by the roadside, they no longer turned away. Some shared the little bread they had. When they heard of injustice, they no longer kept silent, but began to question, even to resist in small ways. One former prisoner later became a teacher. She recalled that in her very first class after the war, when she looked into the weary yet curious eyes of her students, she thought back to the English lessons in camp. From that moment, she resolved to teach not only knowledge, but also critical thinking and intellectual freedom, the very things her generation had been denied. Another, who had once known nothing but obedience, returned and joined charitable groups helping women and orphans. In conversation, she admitted, "I once believed strength was holding a gun and shouting slogans, but in the American camp, I learned that true strength is when you dare to reach out your hand to another." Of course, rebirth was not easy. Post-war Germany was drowning in grief and chaos. Many clung stubbornly to old illusions, refusing to admit the crimes of the Third Reich. When told of the films and truths revealed in the camps, some scoffed. That was just the propaganda of the victors. At times, the women were even mocked as brainwashed by the Americans. But they knew there was no turning back. What they had seen, heard, and felt could not be erased. Even misunderstood, they held fast to their resolve to live differently, to live truthfully, and that quiet determination helped shape a new generation of German women, no longer shackled by the deadly illusions of the past. Decades later, with hair turned silver, they still remembered the morning smell of bacon in the American camp. Yet instead of only guilt, they had learned to see it as a double symbol. On one side, shame at being nourished by the enemy while their people starved. On the other, awakening, the beginning of their journey back to humanity. The day they returned to their ruined homeland was the decisive turning point. From then on, they understood. The memories of the camp were not to be buried, but to be carried with them, like a lantern lighting the path ahead. Amid the rubble, it was the lessons learned in captivity, ironically, that helped them rise, rebuild their lives, and become living witnesses to a bitter truth that must never be forgotten. And perhaps that was their tragedy and their strength, imprisoned by war, yet through war, freed from lies. Decades have passed since the day the German female prisoners of war set foot back on their ruined homeland. The world has changed. Germany was divided, then reunited. Society revived with new houses, streets, and schools. Yet in their minds, the memory of the American camp and the morning smell of bacon lingers, etched like a scar that never fades. At first glance, their post-war lives looked little different from those of ordinary German women. They worked, married, raised children, and later spent their old age surrounded by grandchildren. But upon closer look, one could see in their eyes a vague sadness, a hesitation whenever the war years were mentioned. To others, this seemed like the shared burden of a generation that had lived through destruction. But for them, there was another reason, the memory of kindness from the very enemy. In post-war German society, the topic of American prison camps was once taboo. People could speak of bombs, ruined cities, and post-war hardships, but few dared to mention that prisoners, especially women, had been treated humanely. If anyone admitted they had studied, eaten well, or been sheltered in an American camp, they were instantly branded traitors, shameless for having survived comfortably while fellow citizens starved outside. Thus, for many years, those memories were buried. They kept silent, hid them in diaries, or whispered them to their husbands and children late at night. Some did not even dare to write, afraid that one day someone might read and judge them. Yet memory never disappears. It resurfaced in the most ordinary moments. One morning, When the smell of bacon drifted from the kitchen, their hearts raced. And their minds flew back to the camp, wooden barracks, American soldiers calling to each other outside, the warmth of steaming food. Or sometimes when children asked, "Mother, were you afraid during the war?" That innocent question cut deep, stirring memories they were unsure whether to reveal or conceal. With time, some chose to confront rather than hide. They joined historical research groups, spoke to journalists, or wrote memoirs. Every story told, every page written, brought tears, but also a sense of release. What they emphasized was not the comfort of imprisonment, but the paradox. As prisoners, they were fed and protected. As free citizens returning home, they faced hunger and devastation. This paradox forced them to think, to compare the propaganda they once believed with the truths they saw. And from that, they drew a great lesson. Truth is always more complex than wartime narratives. As German society became more open in confronting its past, their voices began to be heard. Conferences and documentaries invited them to share, and for the first time their memories no longer had to be hidden. People began to realize that the experiences of prisoners, especially women, were not just personal stories, but vital pieces of the larger puzzle of understanding war and its aftermath. In these conversations, they often spoke of bacon as a symbol, not because it was particularly delicious, but because it embodied the first shock of unexpected kindness from the enemy. For them, its smell carried both warmth and guilt. But over the years, they learned to see it differently, as a reminder that even in war, humanity can be chosen over cruelty. Their true legacy lay not in memoirs or articles, but in the way they raised their children and grandchildren. Many taught them never to trust propaganda blindly, but to ask questions and seek truth. Some encouraged their descendants to take part in humanitarian work because they themselves had once been shown compassion in the least expected place. One story was recorded. An elderly former prisoner once went shopping with her grandson. Standing before the bacon aisle, she suddenly burst into tears. Surprised, he asked why, and she told him the whole story. The boy was silent for a moment, then said, "Grandma, so bacon is not just food. It's memory and a lesson for our whole family." That innocent remark felt like liberation to her, for at last, the memory had found a home not only within herself, but also in the next generation. Across decades, these women became not just witnesses of war, but witnesses of a deeper truth. That memory never truly sleeps. It returns, demanding to be faced, urging lessons to be drawn so that mistakes are not repeated. When they passed away, their descendants and historians carried on their stories. And thus, the smell of bacon in the American camps, a detail once so small, became a vivid symbol of memory, contradiction, and the human capacity to change when confronted with truth. Their legacy is not one of battles won or slogans shouted, but a reminder of humanity in war and the responsibility of future generations never again to be led by lies. As history turned its pages, as the echoes of bombs faded and the world moved further into modernity, the story of the German women prisoners in American camps seemed destined to vanish with time. Yet the memory refused to sleep. It endured, not only in the minds of those who had lived it, but also in the generations that followed, as a reminder that history is not written solely through battles and treaties, but also through personal experiences, through moments that appear small, yet possess the power to change human consciousness. The story began with fear, the fear of abuse, humiliation, and cruelty, planted in their minds by Nazi propaganda. But upon entering the American camps, the first thing they encountered was the smell of sizzling bacon, the scent of fullness, of a life they never imagined they would find in the hands of the enemy. From that very moment, a paradox took root. While their homeland starved in ruins, while their families and compatriots suffered in misery, they, the prisoners, were treated with care and dignity. That paradox haunted them, not only during the years of captivity, but throughout their lives. It became a new battle, an inner war. They wrestled with the question, why did the enemy treat them with kindness, while the very nation they trusted, the regime they served, had driven their people into suffering and deceit? The answer was never simple, but the question itself opened the door to awakening, to a journey of reclaiming humanity in souls once shaped by hatred. From these personal memories arises a universal lesson. War does not only destroy homes and lives, it also destroys truth, turning human beings into tools of deception. And sometimes, to escape the fog of propaganda, one needs direct experience, moments of unvarnished reality, even if they come from the most unexpected places, like the smell of bacon in a prison camp. What is remarkable is that instead of letting the memory fester into bitterness or shame, many of the women chose to turn it into guidance for living. They raised their children to question, to doubt, never to believe blindly in any doctrine. They took part in community work, charity, and education, as if to affirm that the lesson of kindness from the enemy was not humiliation, but an opportunity to learn how to be truly human. Looking back, their story reflects another truth. Humanity can emerge anywhere, even in the harshest circumstances of war. The American Guards could easily have chosen cruelty, but they chose differently. They chose to feed, to teach, to offer chances. That choice, modest as it seemed, created an impact far greater than they could have imagined. It shook an entire system of belief and planted the seed of transformation in hearts once nurtured by hatred. This is the story's greatest legacy, not a legacy of victory or defeat, but of humane treatment. It shows that at times, a gesture of kindness can be stronger than an army. A full meal, a small classroom in a prison camp, can leave a deeper imprint than the harshest of sentences. And this legacy has been passed down not only through memoirs and testimonies, but also through ways of living, through the values that these women instilled in their descendants. Placed within a broader context, the story is not merely a fragment of German or American history, but a shared lesson for humanity. In every war, each side tends to dehumanize the other, to see the enemy as monsters undeserving of humane treatment. But when one side breaks that pattern, when it chooses to preserve humanity, it wins a deeper battle, the battle of morality and conscience. Today, as conflicts continue across the globe, the story of these German women prisoners carries renewed meaning. It reminds us that even in the darkest night, light can still be kindled, and that light does not always come from grand gestures. Sometimes it is found in simple acts. A meal, a kind glance, an opportunity to learn. If there is one final message to draw, it is this: history is not only to be remembered, but to be learned from. Personal memories, however small, can serve as mirrors reflecting truth for all of humanity. And the truth of this story is clear. No enemy is wholly monstrous, just as no victory is wholly noble if it lacks humanity. The women of long ago, with their memories of bacon, left the world a lesson both simple and profound. Choose humanity, even in war. For sometimes it is precisely that kindness which endures, beyond bombs, beyond hatred, to become the legacy of generations. And perhaps that is the greatest victory humanity can ever achieve.